welcome back to Groups. I'm excited to jump into another week of discussion around the sermon series Rebuild after a bit of a break last week. Most of you took the week off to make time and space to attend the new monthly prayer summit at the church. If you did not make it out, I would really encourage you to make it a priority to be there next month. We hold the prayer summit on the first Sunday of each month. We're specifically tailoring the summit so that it can be a great place for small groups to come and pray together. We really want groups to come and participate in these summits together as a group. Enough of me talking though, let's get you talking. Here's this week's warm-up question. It is Friday night after a busy week. How do you spend it? All right, so we are in the book of Nehemiah, reading about how the people of Jerusalem rebuilt the wall and their city after exile. We've had some really interesting conversations so far this fall about how we are in a similar rebuilding state in our culture, in the church, and in many of our individual lives. We've talked about what has been hard and lamented together. We have looked at ways in which the church has gone off course. We've talked about how we need to be committed at the core and open at the edges. This week, though, we are moving our discussion to opposition. In chapter 4 of Nehemiah, we see that the people face opposition as they rebuild the wall. The key thing that Pastor Danny noted about this opposition was that it came from outside, meaning other people took issue with what Nehemiah was doing with the wall and tried to put an end to it. The sermon was really about this question: what do we do when Satan brings opposition against us from the outside?
But what I'm talking about this morning in this sermon are those times, like in our text, when the people of God are faithfully following God, seeking His face, walking in His ways, obeying His commands, and it is because of this people's following hard after God that opposition comes.
Before we dive specifically into opposition, though, I want to talk about the walls. Nehemiah was rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem when he encountered opposition. We've been talking about how our walls are torn down and the gates are destroyed for this series Rebuild. We've talked about what things have been hard and where the church has lost its way, but we have not discussed what we are building towards. Nehemiah had a clear vision: rebuild the city walls. But what are the walls that we are rebuilding? I think it's important that we also have a clear vision of where we hope to get to. And as we have done so far in this series, it can be personal. Maybe there are things going on personally for you that you need to rebuild, that you feel God calling you to rebuild. It can be as a church. God may be calling us to rebuild certain things as a church in this time. Or it can be as a people. What is God calling us to rebuild in the world? So take some time and discuss this metaphor of rebuilding walls with your group. What are the walls that we or you are rebuilding? Okay, I hope you had a helpful discussion there to clarify some of the things that we are rebuilding. I also want to remind you that there are no right answers here. What was discussed in your group may not be the same thing as another group, and that is okay. And actually, it's really cool. God is doing many things at once, even within our own church and in our different small groups. But now that we understand what we are rebuilding, what God is calling us to do, like Nehemiah had the walls of Jerusalem, let's focus our discussion in on facing opposition to that rebuilding from people on the outside. Basically, people who aren't working with you to rebuild the walls. Pastor Danny shared that there were 3 things that the people did in chapter 4 of Nehemiah when faced with opposition from the outside. First, they prayed, and they prayed some more. That should be our first instinct when opposition comes, to pray. It is God rebuilding the walls, and so we pray.
Let's see what Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem did in response. And the first thing they did, above all other things, is they prayed. Look at verses 4 and 5. This is Nehemiah. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight. for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. And then over in verse 9, but we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Notice in our text, prayer is the first inclination of Nehemiah's heart. It's his first action, not his last. Opposition against what God is doing among his people is first and foremost a call to prayer. Opposition is not a call to figure it out on our own, to give what we get, to strike first, to try and smear those who oppose us. It is a call to pray.
The second way they responded was to persevere. They kept building the walls. They adjusted their plan and moved forward when they faced opposition.
The second thing we see in our text is that in the face of opposition, Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem persevered. Look at verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. The ultimate goal of our enemy Satan, who's the real puppet master behind those who oppose God and his people, is to bring an end to the work of God in a particular place. If the people of Jerusalem had listened to the taunts, been shaken by the intimidation, become discouraged by the criticism, and given up, that would have been exactly what the point of the opposition was in the first place. Satan wants a defeated church, folks. He wants a scared church. He wants a church that simply goes along with the world because it is afraid of opposition and struggle. A church without a voice. A church that confesses Jesus as Lord with its lips, but lives as if that isn't true. A church that is not engaged in God's mission in the world because God's mission might be too hard or too out of step with the world around us. If all God's people did was gather in a nice old sanctuary, sing a few nice songs, said a few uninspiring prayers, heard a simple, heart-warming, non-challenging message, shook a few hands, had a cup of tea, and went home and did nothing more about their faith until the next Sunday when they repeated the process, Satan would be happy as a pig in you-know-what. But in the face of opposition, Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem don't give in to the threats. They don't stop the work, but they persevere in the midst of the opposition. And what we see is that, in fact, when they do that, what happens? The opposition increases. But still, they persevere.
And finally, they protected each other. They actively looked for ways to protect one another as they built the wall.
The third thing we see in our text that Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem do in the face of opposition is that they protect one another. Look at verse 13. Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And then verse 16, from that day on, half my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah. So half the people work, half the people guard, and then I assume maybe the roles are reversed. They protected one another, and they work on the broken down walls and the burned gates of Jerusalem. They continue on. Now this is important. If we are going to be effectively used by God to rebuild the burned down walls and burnt gates of the church and the culture in the day in which we live, we have got to be vigilant in this area.
This is where I want to bring our second discussion question to. As we start rebuilding, or really all of the time, we will face opposition. Jesus promises that for us as followers of Jesus, that we will face tough things. But just like the people in the book of Nehemiah, God has given us people around us who can protect us, who can come alongside us and be supports, who can potentially see when we're getting into trouble and lift us up. And these people aren't just an idea, they aren't hypothetical people. I think you have those people right now in the room with you, sitting around in a circle. Here's what I want you to discuss together. In what ways can your group actively support one another? Is it checking in throughout the week? Are you struggling with childcare and could use some help? Do you need help with yard work? Is it praying with one another more? But discuss together about the kinds of support you need in this season and ways that as a group you could be there for each other and come alongside one another. So discuss this. How can your group actively support one another in this season? All right, that's all from me for today. Thanks for being here and prioritizing this time together. With whatever time you have left, continue the discussion and talk about things that stood out to you from the sermon, any questions you have, or discuss things that Jesus has been growing in you over the last week. And then take some time to pray together as you finish. Specifically today, pray about opposition, both against opposition so that it wouldn't come, but then also for strength to face it when it does. See you next week.